Okay, well, good morning. First of all, I must say, Ken, I was a little, as a member of a Department of Agricultural Economics, I was a little disturbed to see your pictures of some of our clients there. You know, hogs are orderly and intelligent beasts, and I think there's a slander on hogs in part of your presentation. Well, let me begin by expressing appreciation to Dennis Avery for the invitation to this meeting. Dennis has long been a steadfast and articulate advocate for free trade and technological improvement in agriculture, and he truly has fought the good fight and continues to do so. I also need to acknowledge that this presentation is based on a longer paper I wrote with a colleague at Ohio State University, Brent Songen, a paper that we wrote for Julian Morrison, Kendra Okonski, and their colleagues at the Civil Society Coalition on Climate Change. And several copies of the volume that contains our paper and a number of other interesting reports are available, so please help yourself. Well, in our paper, Brent and I do not address the existence, causes, or magnitudes of global warming. Instead, we assess the likely impacts on global supplies of food and timber of a rise in average temperatures, along the lines of what the IPCC is expressing. So my talk complements Ken's, although I'm a professor of agricultural economics, so it's not going to be terribly entertaining, I suppose. But we look at the commodities of farm products and timber, just as he gave you a quick introduction to energy commodity issues. Needless to say, the impacts that we're investigating arouse substantial debate and concern. Well, much of what has been written about the effects of global warming amounts to a lesson in how not to do environmental economics. In particular, erroneous analysis rests squarely on the assumption that people do not adapt at all as the climate changes. For example, it's supposed that farmers will continue to plant exactly the same crops in just the same places and will still use the same amounts of fertilizer, water, and other inputs, even after changes in the environment demand an adjustment. This is a convenient premise, however. The premise that people are passive and impractical allows for a very simple measure of the agricultural impacts of global warming, a measure that corresponds precisely to the lost production suffered by farmers whose decision-making is entirely impervious to climate variations. And by the way, I can tell you as a member of a Department of Agricultural Economics that there are very, very few, if any, farmers like that left. In contrast, the best studies of the consequences of higher temperatures for agriculture and forestry do not neglect adaptation, which, needless to say, is a salient feature of any successful economy. An important lesson of these studies is that opportunities for adaptation are created by free trade. Yale professor Robert Mendelsohn, whose work has been referred to multiple times during this conference, offers a stylized illustration of the role that trade will play as the world deals with global warming. And I beg to ask your indulgence for a stylized illustration that's even worse than modeling, I'm afraid, but it works. This is an illustration that features two commodities, corn and wheat, as well as a pair of nations, Russia and the United States. Wheat happens to grow better than corn in cooler weather, so a rise in temperatures would reduce the acreage planted in the United States, but increase the area in Russia, where most farmland is closer to the North Pole. I'm referring to Russia, by the way, because chances are good, evidently, if you're paying attention to the political campaign, as we are in Ohio, the chances are that we will soon not be trading with Canada, so I had to substitute Russia for Canada. Sorry. Meanwhile, plantings of corn would increase in the United States and decline in Russia. International trade would dampen the price adjustments. This is the important thing. International trade can be counted on to dampen the price adjustments resulting from these changes in agricultural land use. Again, more wheat grown in Russia, more corn grown in the United States. For example, consider the impacts of a larger wheat harvest in Russia. A larger harvest would drive down domestic prices of that commodity, However, there would also be increased wheat exports, which would push up the domestic market value of the commodity. Russia would also import more corn, which would restrain any increases in that product's price. And there would be actions on the demand side. On the demand side of the market, these changes would prevent relative prices from changing very much. For example, if corn became much more expensive in Russia while the market value of that wheat remained the same, then livestock producers would change the rations fed to cattle and other domesticated animals. As they did this, demand for corn would decline, hence bringing down its price, and demand for wheat would increase, thereby putting upward pressure on its market value. So the bottom line here is that relative prices stay pretty much the same. Note that even in the absence of a large swing in relative prices or terms of trade, farmers face a strong incentive to adapt in just the right way to climate change. Consider an individual who's been raising wheat in Iowa. With wheat yields falling and the ratio of corn prices to wheat prices not changing much, switching to corn is attractive. Meanwhile, additional land is being sown to wheat at higher latitudes in Russia. In each case, market forces are promoting exactly the right response to a warmer environment. Well, since trade ought to limit the effects of global warming on prices of agricultural commodities, and pretty much all the research is showing that, Mendelsohn and other economists have focused on the impacts of climate change on the value of agricultural real estate. Now, the value of agricultural real estate obviously depends not only on prices, but on costs of production as well. And in some places, costs of production will go up, other places, costs of production will go down. And the research clearly shows, and there's actually a large literature on this in major economic journals, the literature clearly shows that property values will be less affected in regions and nations that trade freely than in places that are economically isolated. Well, a number of speakers at this conference have pointed out that there's good reason to be more concerned about the hydrologic impacts of global warming than higher temperatures per se. One study, for example, done by some economists at Berkeley, reaches the conclusion that serious damage could occur to farming in the central and eastern United States where rain-fed farming predominates. This damage could occur if climate change causes precipitation to decline. Well, just as they can adapt to warming, farmers are able to deal with diminished water availability in various ways. However, they will do so only if prices are efficient. In contrast, adjustment to the drier conditions that higher temperatures will create in many settings is less likely if prices are distorted by irrigation subsidies, for example. Throughout Latin America, I mainly work in Latin America, and that brings up another thing, Ken. You've revealed to me how our energy policy, I'm tempted to say it's as if it's being designed by a Honduran populist, but that would be a slander on Honduran populists, I'm afraid. Throughout Latin America, as in the United States, it has to be said, the prices that farmers pay for water rarely reaches 5% of the cost of delivering this resource to their fields. Understandably, incentives to adopt even the most rudimentary conservation measures just aren't there. And we see this. Even rudimentary drip irrigation systems aren't used where farmers essentially pay nothing for water. Well, already excessive, the waste and misallocation created when water is supplied too cheaply to farmers are likely to grow worse if the planet warms. Another thing to keep in mind about economic research carried out so far about the effects of global warming is that relatively little attention has been paid to technological improvement, even though climate change is sure to stimulate a search for new ways to use natural resources and other inputs to produce farm goods. Last week's Economist magazine, for example, had an article, I think it was the title was on the cover, The New Green Revolution, about new uses for GM crops, and among the developments that are currently being pursued is to come up with drought-resistant varieties. There's a research gap here of considerable importance since technological advances have had a huge impact on agricultural yields in the past. Consider the United States. The U.S. Department of Agriculture started started gathering data and reporting national average cereal yields, yields of corn, wheat, other grains that account for 60 to 65% of the human diet, when you take into account direct consumption as well as indirect consumption through livestock. Our yield, the first year that an average was reported, was 25 bushels per acre. That's about equivalent to 1.5 metric tons per hectare. The yield stayed at exactly that level for about 70 years until the middle 1930s, by which time the fruits of a long investment in agricultural R&D were starting to become apparent. Around the middle 1930s, farmers started to use hybrid seeds, inorganic fertilizer, and so forth. And since the 1930s, as our agricultural labor force has gone down by 75%, as agricultural land use has consistently gone down, then our production, our yields have gone up by a factor of 5 to 6. Same thing has happened for the same reason at an international scale. Here you see trends in the global average cereal yield since the early 1960s. Now, for those of us who were in college back in the 1960s, remember Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb. It was a scary book. Well, precisely at the time when Paul Ehrlich was writing, and the Club of Rome and others were spreading gloom and doom, that was about the time when the Green Revolution started. Green Revolution started to have an effect in the middle 1960s, well, and went on for 15 to 20 years. During and since the Green Revolution, as you can see, the global average cereal yield has gone from about 1.5 metric tons per hectare. Again, the U.S. average yield from the middle 1860s till the middle 1930s. That yield more than doubled. It's estimated that the Green Revolution on its own saved 1 billion lives. Norman Borlaug, the father of the Green Revolution, so to speak, is someone who actually deserved his Nobel Prize. Well, relative to this growth in yields, impacts of global warming on cereal yields are very likely to be negligible. Well, let me turn briefly to the forestry sector. Climate change of the magnitude now being forecast by the IPCC will have pronounced influences on tree-covered ecosystems. Some forest types will shift location farther from the equator or up mountain slopes. Others will burn more often, more severely, or both. Pests and diseases may affect new areas. Some locations will become unsuitable for trees, while tree growth will increase in other settings. While there's little agreement on the pattern and timing of impacts in specific locations, the ecologists consulted by the IPCC agree unanimously that climate change will affect forest structure and function profoundly. There's an important caveat here. By and large, the ecologists' findings are based on research undertaken in unmanaged ecosystems of the sort that remain in Alaska, where Ken fishes for salmon, in Canada and Russia, as well as the Amazon and Congo River basins. However, most of the world's forests have been heavily influenced by human management, having been harvested once or multiple times, or regenerated, as in the case of Georgia, the country of Finland, many places, regenerated after prior agricultural use. Simply recognizing that climate change could have substantial consequences in the absence of management, as the ecologists have done, increases human responses and the costs and benefits of these responses. Bottom line, it's very unlikely that global warming will have catastrophic consequences for timber production, even in the absence of human adaptation. At present, estimated impacts range from small and negative to large and positive, and management by foresters will further contain any negative impacts which might arise. It's often claimed, many of you are aware of this, that it's often claimed that less developed regions close to the equator will suffer disproportionately because of global warming. Well, commercial forestry is a major counterexample. As temperatures rise, wood products obtained from warm settings will increase, not decrease, and it is likely that the portion of global timber supplies coming from the low latitudes close to the equator will increase as the portion harvested in temperate settings declines. One of the main reasons for this, I'm going to abbreviate the discussion here, but again, trade policy matters here. An efficient shift in the global forestry sector, which again will benefit developing countries in the tropics and subtropics, will be impeded if temperate countries protect their national forestry sectors, as has been done all too often in the past. Well, if mitigating global warming is burdensome, as it certainly is certainly the case, then it makes sense to keep greenhouse gases in check only if the alternative, which is to adapt to global warming, is equally or more costly. For two key sectors of the economy, however, this is decidedly not the case. We will not all go hungry or run out of wood products if temperatures rise. To the contrary, agricultural and forestry impacts will be modest at most, at least on a global scale. Furthermore, successful adaptation in the two sectors will not require central planning by governments. To the contrary, adaptation is best accomplished by relying on the sort of decision-making that happens routinely in competitive and unregulated markets. Decision-making, of course, that is decentralized yet coordinated because everyone faces the same prices for scarce resources. Government can be and often is the source of harm. Irrigation subsidies and protectionism in agriculture and forestry are damaging. Even when environmental conditions are consistently ideal, the harm will be multiplied if the earth grows warmer. Indeed, waste and misallocation created by these policies will almost certainly exceed the costs which occur in commodity markets because of climate change. In the final analysis, much of the alarmist literature about the effects of global warming boils down to the claim that individuals, firms, and entire economies which refuse to adjust in any way to environmental flux will suffer harm. This is a very poor argument indeed for governmental intervention with interference with market forces, as the alarmists advocate. The only thing they have demonstrated is that inflexibility will lead to ruin if the climate changes, but that, for that matter, ruin will be the end result, even if mild temperatures and gentle rains continue all our days and all the days of our progeny. Thank you very much.